Avon Resources Limited is a gold exploration company with significant projects in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and the Yukon. Trading on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol ABN, and the pink symbol ABN-AF. Surrounded by world-class gold deposits and mines, Avon's 23,000 hectares Forest Kerr Gold Project is located in the heart of the Golden Triangle in northwestern BC. For more information, visit us at avonresources.com.
Welcome to the Goddard Report. Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is investigative reporter Spencer Fernando. Welcome back to the show, Spencer.
Good to be here.
Spencer, is there a difference between Conservative leader Andrew Scheer and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau? What is the difference?
I'd say I think there's a pretty big difference. I mean, Scheer's definitely more conservative than Trudeau is. Definitely wants to lower taxes. He's against the carbon tax. I think he overall would favor a smaller role for government. So, yeah, I think there's definitely some, especially ideological differences between them.
A lot of critics say that when you come down to the crunch, there's little difference between the Conservatives and the Liberals, though. Once they get into government, they tend to act very much the same, very arrogant, and very little consideration of what the wishes of the people are.
Yeah, there's definitely some truth to that. I think, there's some ideological differences, but there does seem to be an attitude of arrogance that parties get in power. But I think a bigger problem is that it's the government itself. The institution that they inherit is far too big, far too powerful. There needs to be decentralization down to the provinces. And then, no matter how arrogant someone is when they got into office, they would be in charge of something that was less powerful overall. I mean, the federal government was originally only supposed to focus on a few things, like national infrastructure, foreign policy, national defense, and the courts, and it's continuously expanded and expanded. And I think it needs to shift back towards more of the traditional role that it used to have.
Is there any way for Canadians to get politicians to pay more attention to what they would like to see governments do?
Yeah, I think you need to pressure people. Social media is a good way to do that. Writing letters, threatening to go to the media. I've worked in politics, worked for an MP, worked for, different parties at different levels. And, when politicians are worried they're going to get some bad press, they do tend to listen pretty well to what people are going to say. So I think people need to be willing to use that tactic. And one of the things today is that everyone is now the media, right? Through social media, through your own website or your own show. It doesn't cost too much for people to get a message out to a lot of people at once. And I think, people need to be, I wouldn't say, take like a threatening tone with politicians, but I'd just say, be honest with them. Say, look, if you're not willing to listen, then you're going to go to the media or you're going to share your opinion about them, make your voice heard. And I think that's how it has to be. Again, politicians are supposed to serve us, right? So they should be kind of worried about what people will say if they're not actually doing their job.
Proportional representation, BC's holding a referendum on that. Does that give people more of a voice in what the government does?
No, I don't think so. I think we should stick with the current system. The way the system is now, it forces parties to be somewhat more broad in their appeal. Because if you want to win, you're going to need at least, at minimum, 35%, most likely 45%. And that forces parties to, kind of represent a wider range of viewpoints and compromise within parties. And I think going to a proportional system would not be a good thing, and it would create a lot of just endless fighting. You see that in a lot of Europe. You have like 30 parties that have seats, and it's chaotic.
A lot of people here have said, "Oh, that's just panic. Canadians aren't like that. We're not going to vote for Nazi-like parties." Is that really true?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't be worried about like a extreme far right party in Canada or anything like that. But we would just see parties broken up into a bunch of different special interest groups that would each have their own party. Parties getting 2%, 3%, 4%. And the problem is that if things, as we've seen in Europe, sometimes the way things break down is you could have two moderate parties, get a fair amount of votes, but then the majority, all the power gets put into the hands of the kingmaker party, which can sometimes be really radical, either radical far right party or radical far left party. And that can be a big problem. So again, I think we should stick with the current system.
Do you think in BC the government's misrepresenting the positive side of proportional representation when they say, oh, well, we wouldn't be beholden to small parties, and yet on the other hand, 3 Green Party seats are running the NDP government in BC, saying we won't support you unless you go along with our agenda? Is that an example of what would happen with proportional?
Yeah, we just see that, basically on steroids, it would get more and more like that. And, the BC government is definitely, if they're trying to say there's no downside to proportional representation, then they're just lying to people.
Also, it's very confusing. They say if you vote yes for this thing, then you have to choose between 3 different systems of proportional, and the government is actually refusing to say what it would actually look like in action.
Mm-hmm.
Is that typically what happens in things like this?
Well, it's pretty dangerous for people to be voting on something when the government doesn't even want to describe what it is, so that's not good. And also, we've had a system that's worked very well for a long time. No country's perfect, but I'd say, Canada is the best country in the world, and we've become that way under the current system we have. So throwing that system away for a system that shows no real benefits in other countries really makes no sense to me.
We'll have more with Spencer Fernando right after this.
Hi, I'm Douglas Mason, President and CEO of Magnum Gold Corp, MGI and the TSX Venture Exchange. A 2015 drill program on the LH property intersected several high-grade gold intersections, including 11 meters of 20.66 grams per ton gold. Additional drill targets on the LH property have been identified by a 2018 drone airborne magnetic survey to further evaluate a pyrrhotite-enriched gold-bearing system. Please visit our website at magnumgoldcorp.com.
Arctic Star Exploration, operated by a team of proven mine finders, is focused on diamonds in Finland and the Northwest Territories of Canada. Work programs are underway in Finland and Canada. Arctic Star trades on the TSX Venture Exchange symbol ADD, on Frankfurt symbol 82A1, and the OTCQB symbol ASDZF. Please visit our website arcticstar.ca or call us at 604-689-1799.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Spencer Fernando. Spencer, is nationalism growing in Canada?
I'm not sure. I don't see, Canadian nationalism is not, to me, a bad thing. I think it's actually a good thing. Putting your own country's interests, ahead of everything else. That's what, a country's supposed to do. That's what a national government is supposed to do. But unfortunately, it seems, there's really a post-nationalist movement going on where, Justin Trudeau, politicians like him are really trying to push the idea that we shouldn't care about our own country or we should put international interests first, which is dangerous. So I would hope to see, Canadian nationalism, make a comeback. I think it's needed and important. And, right now I don't know if we're seeing it too much. We'll see if politicians have the courage to say it. Because you can see the left is really trying to demonize the word nationalism, trying to associate it with racism. Even though if you look throughout history, Churchill was a British nationalist, Gandhi was a Indian nationalist. There's a lot of positive nationalist movements, just like there have been some negative ones. So it's not inherently a positive or negative thing. It really depends on the country in which it's applied. And in a free and democratic country like Canada, I think nationalism is a good thing.
Why do you think it's always attached to, the National Socialist Party was the long name for Nazis, and other dictators have also gone under the nationalist banner. Doesn't it make it hard for you to say, well, it's a good thing for your country?
Well, there's lots of Canadians who've called themselves Canadian nationalists as well. Like, there's a long history of a Canadian nationalist movement. So, and again, it's interesting. National socialism, right? How come no one ever says it's socialism is Nazism, right? And very interesting how the double standard gets applied. People can call themselves socialists, even though the worst regimes in history, the Nazis, the USSR, the Communist Party in China, those were all socialists. They all called themselves socialists. So I would say that socialism is really the thing we should be worried about. And again, nationalism in terms of putting your country first, you could also call it patriotism. It depends on the country. Canada is a country where we believe in freedom, where we believe people of different backgrounds can come together around shared values. And I think promoting that and being nationalistic about our country is a good thing when it's applied in a country like Canada.
Would a nationalist Canada still be involved in things like peacekeeping?
Well, I think it's interesting. There's a big myth that kind of peacekeeping was what Canada's really always been about. For most of our history, we've actually, often built up a very large military. After World War II, We had among the largest Navy, largest Air Force in the world. And then there's kind of this myth where, it's all about peacekeeping in the United Nations. And, we've seen our military budget really kind of fall apart since then. So I think, I really think peacekeeping should take a back seat to building our own military and protecting our own country.
Right now, of course, the international focus on Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered by the Saudis in the Saudi embassy in Turkey. Has Canada taken enough of a stand about this? It seems we're pretty shy after the Saudis really slapped Canada around for criticizing their human rights record.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the government made a statement that it was unacceptable and that they'd look at the arms deal. And then like a day later, Trudeau said, I can't cancel the deal. So to me, it's all been very weak. I mean, the thing about Khashoggi is it's obviously a terrible thing, but, Saudi Arabia has been treating their own people horribly for a long time. They execute gay people. They treat women horribly. Christians get oppressed. Any religious minority there gets oppressed. They've been absolutely devastating Yemen, killing loads of civilians there. And so no real interest in any of that until, a journalist is killed. So obviously very sad. But, if this is finally waking people up to what Saudi Arabia has always been about, that's a good thing. But the Canadian government, if they really want to send a message, then ban oil imports from Saudi Arabia and ban all arms sales to them. Those are things the government has the authority to do. And if we really want to be serious, we should be using our own Canadian energy in our own country, not getting oil from Saudi Arabia.
Would that be a good reason to build the Energy East pipeline?
Yeah, definitely. What other country has as much oil as we do and still imports it from halfway around the world? It's pretty insane. And it's embarrassing. The government you can't criticize Saudi Arabia and have any credibility when you're selling weapons to them and you're getting oil from them. It's obviously empty words. So until that changes, I think we can just ignore what anybody says, about Saudi Arabia if they're selling weapons to them or taking their oil.
We'll have more with Spencer Fernando right after this.
I'm Brian Fowler, president of Blind Creek Resources Limited, listed on the TSX Venture Exchange, ticker symbol BCK. Blind Creek is focused in the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and British Columbia. The company's key property is the Blend Project, one of the largest undeveloped lead zinc silver deposits in Western Canada, plus plans to advance the recently acquired, fully permitted historic Engineer gold mine in the Atlan District of Northwestern BC. Check us out at blindcreekresources.com.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Spencer Fernando. Spencer, is Maxime Bernier continuing to gain traction with his People's Party of Canada?
It's tough to tell. It seems like there's, riding associations being built, so it looks like there's an infrastructure still raising money. So there is something, being built behind the scenes. And there's a poll recently. He was, I think, in a Nanos poll. I believe it was about 1 or 2% he was at. So we'll see if it grows from there. Time will tell. A big question will be whether he gets in the debates or not, because that's a chance to get a lot of attention. And then, of course, the fears about vote splitting, right? We'll see what happens there. So I think at this point it's too early to tell whether he's gained much traction yet, but it's going to take many more months, more polling, more fundraising numbers, and recruiting candidates. That's going to be the big thing. He says he's going to run candidates in all the ridings, and that's a big challenge for parties to do, and we'll see if he's able to get there.
Is the name the People's Party of Canada an unfortunate choice?
I don't think so. I think he probably watched how good Doug Ford did with his, government of the people, governing for the people slogan. So, again, and that's, really, the government is supposed to work for the people. I don't know why that's a big controversial thing. So, yeah, I think it's not a bad name. Maybe not the best name either, but I think at the end of the day, people are going to look at what they think the parties are going to do to help their lives as opposed to the name. And, slogan worked well for Doug Ford, so we'll see if it works for Bernier.
Do you think Bernier would be encouraged that the French president became successful and didn't even belong to an organized party until, I think, a year before their elections?
Yeah, it definitely shows that it's possible. I think across much of the world, we're seeing that people, the attachments people used to have to traditional political parties are really starting to fade. in large part because people aren't getting results. I mean, Brazil, for example, they just elected somebody who's really promising a pretty big overhaul of the status quo. And it's not surprising there. I mean, Brazil's had horrible corruption. I mean, like dozens and dozens of politicians of all parties, I think, going to prison. The economy's horrible. Crime is out of control. So I don't think it's a surprise that people are looking for, anyone who promises to shake up the status quo.
In Canada, the Privacy Commissioner is raising concerns about Stats Canada having the right to dip into, not take your bank account, but get all your personal banking information without your consent. Should that be a concern to Canadians?
Well, it should be a huge concern. I mean, again, just like we talked about, the government's supposed to be serving us, right? So if someone serves you, they shouldn't be allowed to just access all your information. That's a big problem. And just the attitude that's obviously within the government that thinks it's okay to take that information is a huge problem. And then there's obviously the example of privacy breaches. I mean, even the U.S. Pentagon, which they're probably spending more than any other institution in the world to protect their secrets, they get hacked regularly. So, I mean, Facebook gets hacked, all these big companies, super smart tech companies, they get hacked. So to think that Stats Canada or the Canadian government would be able to protect our info, especially when other government agencies have regularly lost tons of info or had it stolen by employees, nobody should think that info is going to be safe. And the idea that they say it's all going to be anonymized and no one will ever know, I mean, there's no reason to believe the government on any of that, considering their track record is pretty terrible.
Can you believe Stats Canada when they say we're only going to have this information, we won't pass it on to other government agencies like the RCMP or Revenue Canada?
No, I don't think so. I really don't think you can really trust what any government agency says. They're all trying to expand their own power. They'll do whatever they do behind the scenes, whatever they think is the right thing to do, regardless of, what we think or even asking us. So yeah, there's no reason to trust them. And I think this really calls into question, a lot of maybe even the stats they're sharing, because, if they're willing to do this behind the scenes and they're willing to, take this information, and if their attitude is that they can get all this stuff without telling us, then who knows what else they're not telling us? Who knows? Maybe data is being manipulated. Who knows what's really happening?
What about the excuse, oh, well, legislation allows us to do it, it's perfectly legal, so that makes it okay?
Yeah, well, I mean, legislation's, like we're supposed to have control over that as Canadians, right? So that legislation can be changed. I always found that funny when politicians whose literal job is to legislate say that, oh, legislation, I can't do anything because that's the law. Well, your job as a politician is to change the law if there's a problem. So to use the law or legislation as the excuse. I mean, if that's your excuse, then you should just quit and go do something else because you're obviously not doing your job. So yeah, I think Canadians should really be pushing for these things to be changed. I mean, the Conservatives have been criticizing it, and rightfully so. But the Conservatives were also in power for a long time, and those laws were still in place. So I think we need to start putting pressure on all politicians to not just criticize the other parties when something like this happens, or to criticize the government, but actually to promise that they are going to change these laws and make it so Stats Canada can't do that.
Well, I can tell you when Paul Martin was finance minister, I asked him, Mr. Finance Minister, why don't you take the huge surplus in the EI fund, at the time about $53 billion, and put it into the pension fund, which is underfunded? And he says, well, yeah. Jim, I can't do that. That's illegal. And I just said, sir, you're the finance minister. You could change that tomorrow. And he just walked away.
Yeah.
Yeah. So is that the kind of treatment that we get all too often? Once they're elected, they live in ivory towers and forget about the peasants who support them?
Yeah, it seems like it. I think you're exactly right with that. I mean, they get in office and then, oh, sorry, my hands are tied. Well, then guess we should have voted for somebody else, right? Because your job is to change the laws and fix problems. And it would be like a CEO, a company hires a new CEO because the previous one did a bad job and said all these rules and regulations in the company are stopping us from growing. So they hire the new guy. He comes in and says, oh, well, man, can't really improve the company because all these laws and regulations are in place. Well, then why'd you hire the new guy, right? So, yeah, I think that's something we have to really push for. And I think we have to start pushing for concrete promises from people. I mean, the Conservatives are saying they're against this potential privacy breach, which is good. But we should be demanding that, okay, then make an ironclad promise that if you get into government, then you'll pass legislation to make it so Stats Canada can't get this info. Because if they're not willing to say that, then they're just criticizing without actually having a plan to fix it, right? So that's what we need to watch out for. People, can be very good at criticizing things when they're out of power, but when they get in power, they just do the same thing. So have to watch out for that.
Should there be legislation that makes politicians follow up on their promises? I mean, I remember Jean Chrétien's Little Red Book where he said his first promise was to get rid of the GST. Well, take a look at the latest bill. You know, when you go to the grocery store or the department store, you're paying GST. Mm-hmm. Should politicians really be held to that standard?
Yeah, I think so. I think their pay should be tied to it as well. They should get a very low salary base, you know, maybe just above what the average person makes, maybe just the same as the median income. And then any pay above that is performance based, you know. So yeah, if you don't keep your promises, you don't get any extra money. The rest of us have to work harder to earn our money. We have to keep our promises. If you go for a job interview and the company says, this is what we're looking for, and you say, yeah, I can do it, and then you get in and the first thing you do your first day is say, hey, all that stuff I said, I can't do it anymore, they would just fire you because they'd say, well, you lied to us, right? So it should be the same for politicians.
If minimum wage was so good, how come politicians don't work for minimum wage?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not only that, but I mean, they get so many other benefits. I mean, they get per diems. So when they're in Ottawa, they get their meals paid for. And if they don't use that money for meals, then they get checks for it or they get extra money for it. So it's not just that they get paid way more than the average person, but they get loads of other benefits, you know, housing allowances, cost allowances, you know. So, and they're some of the only people in the world who get to change their own salary. I mean, they get to vote on what they get paid. They try to say it's independent, right? There's an independent commission, but they appoint the members of the commission and they give them their instructions. So they control their own salaries and they keep choosing to pay themselves way more than most of us make.
Should politician pay be put up to referendum?
Totally. Again, this is the whole thing, right? If they work for us, then they say it all the time. Oh, the people are the boss, right? Well, normally the boss gets to say what people get paid, right? There's no other situation where you apply for a job, you get hired, and then you tell your boss, yeah, this is what you're paying me now, and there's nothing you can do about it. So if we're really the boss, then it should be up to us.
The politicians always say the reason they have such high salaries is otherwise they wouldn't attract quality people to run for office. Do you really believe that?
No, I think anyone just has to watch Question Period, and then they can come to their own conclusion about whether that's quality people. I mean, there's some good ones in there for sure, but not all of them are too impressive. And again, it's supposed to be about public service. I think pay them enough to get by, pay them enough to have, a decent life, and, if they want to bring their family to live with them in Ottawa, nothing wrong with that. But I think above that, they shouldn't be getting rich off of it. They can go get rich after if they want to go work for a company or something. But people, and the pension issue too, right? The pensions they get way more generous. They get them for life. I mean, it's all way too generous.
Calgary is debating whether it should host the Winter Olympics or a bid to host the Winter Olympics. The Alberta and federal governments say they're ready to chip in a certain amount of money, but Calgary would still be on the hook for a large portion of it. Should all of the costs be covered by senior governments instead of on local taxpayers?
Well, I'm not too sure about the whole, Olympic thing. I mean, it's obviously very nice to have your city showcased in the world and all that. But, the last few Olympics we've seen, they make big promises about, it'll bring in way more money than we end up spending. It doesn't really end up happening. Cities are left with huge bills for stadiums, and facilities that really aren't used after the Olympics. And, there's other problems, crime, infrastructure. Really need to take care of the basics first. So, I don't know if, going for the Olympics makes the most sense.
Well, Vancouver probably was an exception to that whole rule because the Olympic facilities here were finished so soon that they were ready to go 2 years in advance. They're still being used today. So a lot of people would say it got a good legacy out of it. But yeah, you look at Sochi, $50 billion spent. It's a ghost town now. The same thing with South Korea's host city for the last Winter Olympics. Local merchants say they were in a security zone where they couldn't get customers during the games, and then afterwards, nobody came to their town.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's no guarantee.
If they could have, the same people around the Vancouver Olympics and they put together a very good plan for not going over cost, then, perhaps it might be reasonable, but, chances are it's not going to end up being profitable. Hopefully that's not the case, but, and again, not even sure they're going to get it, right? That's still far away. But, Yeah, I don't know. At this point, I think it's, governments around the world and even in Canada here really need to focus on the basics, what they were actually elected to do. Basic services, public safety, infrastructure, focused on that, and the rest tends to take care of itself.
Do you think politicians like big mega projects because they get to cut a ribbon?
Oh, for sure. And they get international attention. I mean, fixing a crime problem in Calgary or in Winnipeg or anywhere, or fixing a local road, that might be the job of a politician, but they don't get international attention for it. And, people in politics tend to have big egos. I say this as someone who's been involved in politics for a long time, so perhaps talk about myself a little bit too. But, people, they like the attention. And that's why you have to, really look at getting back to the basics, right? If someone really wants loads of attention in politics, that go work for the UN or something like that, right? You should really be serving your local community and your own country. And, if you want to be famous, then go do something else.
Well, Vancouver's, former mayor now, Gregor Robertson, spent almost a year outside of the country. Now, whether he was promoting Vancouver or promoting himself, a lot of people have questions about that. Is that what a lot of politicians like to do?
Yeah, I mean, Catherine McKenna's a great example of that, right? She lectures everybody about, not using too much energy, but then she flies around the world to go to global conferences. I mean, we're talking on Skype right now. She could easily be using Skype to, talk to people, around the world, have those meetings through Skype, save a lot of money. But, then you wouldn't get the international press, you wouldn't get all the attention, wouldn't get all the globe-trotting and the nice hotel stays and all the taxpayer-funded benefits and all that stuff. So, I think we need to hold people accountable, hold them to their own rules. And, you don't need to, if you want to promote a city, you don't need to necessarily fly around the world all the time.
Facebook's CEO is going to be questioned by Canadian and UK government members now about privacy, I would imagine. Is that a good thing?
If it was only about privacy, I'd say it's a good thing, but my concern is that it's actually going to be more about regulating content. I think, and this is, generally don't find myself necessarily sympathizing with social media companies, but in this case I do. I think there's been far too much, forgetting about individual responsibility. People want to hold the platforms. Some crazy guy goes on a platform and says something, and then they say, oh, that's the responsibility of the platform. Well, no, it's the responsibility of the crazy guy. If there's a town square up in the middle of a city, someone puts up a board and says, oh, you can share your information here, and someone goes and posts some crazy, horrible message. It's not the fault of the person who put up, the board. It's the fault of the person who put up the message. So I think, we need to get back to the whole idea of individual responsibility. And part of it is just realizing that in a free society, people are free to say really whatever they want, unless they're obviously inciting violence against people. And sometimes people are going to say very horrible things. But if you try to regulate all speech and control what people are going to say, you're going to stop a lot of creative ideas too. And you're going to stop a lot of people who are legitimately questioning those who are in power. So, I'm pretty sure the Liberals are going to try to use their meeting with, Facebook to pressure them to shut down alternative news.
Oh, and getting back to Maxime Bernier, do you think Western separatists are likely to support Bernier and the People's Party of Canada?
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure how big the Western separatist movement is. I think most people in the country want Canada to be united, but I think understandably there is feeling that the West gets used as a piggy bank and then totally screwed over by the central government. And it's interesting how when Harper was in power, there was a big decline, obviously, in Western separatist sentiment and also a decline in Quebec separatist sentiment. And Harper was never popular in Quebec, but the one thing he generally understood was that he tried, for the most part, to stay out of provincial jurisdiction. And people respected that. So even people in Quebec who didn't like him as a leader, respected the fact that he was willing to, give provincial governments more independence and, autonomy. And support for separation went down. Whereas, Trudeau is a big time centralizer. He wants more and more power taken away from provinces and local communities and given to him and the central government. So there's a big rise in, separatism, in feeling in the West and even in Quebec, I think there's not necessarily more separatism there, but they just elected a government that's very much pushing against what a lot of the Trudeau government is trying to do. So I think the lesson is you have to let people closest to the issues, be in control, let local communities have more power and control, and, decentralize rather than the opposite.
Andrew Scheer said he may recriminalize marijuana if he's elected. Is that a killer for him in the election campaign?
Well, yeah, that's a pretty bad idea, but I think he backtracked pretty quickly on that. I think 1 or 2 days after he said that, he said that he wouldn't actually do that. So I think he got a pretty big backlash. It's interesting. I did a poll on Twitter. Obviously not a scientific poll, but I'd say most of my readers tend to be pretty conservative. And I asked, should it be decriminalized or recriminalized? And only a very small percentage said it should be recriminalized. I think people generally accept that going back that way would not be too helpful. So, yeah, I think Scheer, he backtracked pretty quickly on that one.
Do you people suspect that if he said it once, that's what he truly believes?
I think he's torn between maybe some of what he's hearing within his party, people who are upset about it, and then the broader public opinion. But, it's a tough issue for conservatives because there's, about half the conservative party who's really totally against any loosening of those laws. Then another half that's much more libertarian about it and says, it's really not worse than alcohol, and should we be sending people to jail or giving people criminal records for, using that substance? Probably not. So I think he's kind of torn on that. And I don't think he wants to fight the election on that. I think he wants to fight it mostly on the carbon tax. And the more time he spends talking about marijuana, the worse it is for him.
The federal government says if it imposes a carbon tax on the 4 provinces that have fought the most against it, it'll give rebates to those residents. However, what about places like British Columbia that's been charging a carbon tax for over a decade? Would they get rebates as well?
Yeah, I think they're not really interfering too much in provinces that already have a carbon tax. But I think you can't really trust anything they're saying on the rebates because it's really a big fraud. It's just shifting money around. You take the tax on one hand, and then you give money on the other. But those are two separate things. It's the government just deciding to make payments to people and then taxing them. So it's not actually money from the carbon tax going into a special carbon tax fund and then being given to people. It's just money going to general revenue. And the amount the government has said that the rebate is going to be, even in those 4 provinces, is less than a lot of estimates have said it's actually going to cost families every year. So, there's no precedent for a tax that ends up giving people more money back. That makes no sense at all. Then it's not a tax, right? So to me it's a big fraud. And they keep giving certain exemptions. They just gave an exemption to New Brunswick Power, where they're going to be exempt, I think, 95.5% of carbon tax payments. And that's because they're afraid of losing seats in New Brunswick in the next election. So they can't really have it both ways. They can't say that without a carbon tax in Canada, the world will be destroyed by climate change. Oh, but here's a bunch of exemptions. It's obviously not a big, scary world-ending issue if they can give exemptions all over the place.
Has it not also been pointed out that Canada supplies all this energy to the world, and we expend a lot of energy growing food for the rest of the planet? If you really clamp down on those two things, you're not just hurting Canadians, you're hurting people everywhere.
Yeah, there was just a report today saying there needs to be a massive increase in global food production. So I don't know where they expect that to come from if every country is kind of pushing back on their production to reduce emissions. Also, Canada contributes almost nothing to global emissions. We absorb tons of CO2 in our forests. All the emission increases are coming from non-Western countries, China and India especially. So anything we do, and Trudeau even admitted that. Very funny. He went on a show in Quebec and said that, if other countries aren't making changes, then what Canada does really doesn't make a difference. So funny that he would admit that and still impose a carbon tax on everybody. But, to me, it's really a big fraud. Look at the income tax, right? That was supposed to be a temporary tax during World War I, and it looks like it's still around. So, yeah, they just come up with a new reason to impose a tax on people, and they just want the money.
Plus, this tax does not come with any promises that all the money raised by it will do something like improve transit for people so they don't have to use their cars. Because for most Canadians, your alternative for going to work is, well, you take the car, the truck, or you walk or take a bike.
Yeah.
And are you going to walk 50 miles to the place where you work?
Well, exactly. And, if you look at the way Canada is set up, it's tons of territory. It's very cold. It's a first world country, so technologically advanced. And our cities are extremely spread out, both within them and from each other. So if you could think of any reason for a country that would have high emissions, Canada would be it. There's no real way around that. Plus, but again, if you look at our forests, we absorb tons of CO2 as well. So I think, either it's ego or just something else, some sort of agenda, but Canadian leaders need to realize that we're not really a big global player when it comes to emissions. What we do just really doesn't matter that much. And the idea that Canada is going to set an example for no. The United States is not sitting around saying, oh, well, Canada put on a carbon tax, I guess we'll do the same. If anything, they're looking, saying, well, I guess we'll get a competitive advantage by cutting our taxes and regulations, and we'll get billions in investment moving from Canada to the U.S., which is exactly what's happening.
Yes, if you talk to people from around the world and ask them, before you moved here or came to visit, did you ever think of Canada about anything? And their answer is, no, never did. So how can you be an example?
Exactly. And it's embarrassing, and it's really disappointing, because we could be much richer than we are if you look at the resources we have, the amount of land and, opportunity we have here. And we're really basically being constrained for something that's not really Canada's problem. We can't fix the problem. And if anything, if you look throughout all of history, environmental improvements don't come from taxes. They come from innovation. And I think that's where, if you want to reduce emissions, that's how it's going to happen. People are going to keep using the cheapest, most plentiful source of fuel until something else emerges that's cheaper and more plentiful. So for a very long time, for at least 50 more years, it's going to be oil. And even beyond 50 years, oil is still going to be a huge percentage of world energy production. So to think that we should shut down our own oil industry here, that's not going to stop the world from using oil. It's just going to stop us from making money off of it. And that's less money for everything, less money for the military, less money for infrastructure, less money for healthcare. So we're not doing anything for the world. We're just shooting ourselves in the foot.
Spencer, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Good talking to you.
My guest has been investigative reporter Spencer Fernando. You can find his articles at spencerfernando.com. If you have any questions for Spencer or any of our other guests, you can send them to info@howstreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. The Goddard Report is available online and mobile at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. The Goddard Report is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.